here has read the Odyssey? Who here hasn't read the Odyssey? All right, well, this will be a treat for all of you then, because we're going to try to do a abridged overview of the entire story today. That's part of what we're going to do. I'm going to try to keep it lively and moving along. But if you read it, who here has read it but didn't read it when they were in either middle school or high school or college? So some people have read it since then. Well, that's good. You get a point for that because I think it is a book that bears reading and rereading. The Odyssey is, in fact, one of my favorite books, and it is one of the greatest epics ever written. And it's become the basis for countless adventure stories that have followed it. And it's almost a joke to say something is based on the Odyssey. Well, of course it's based on the Odyssey. What else could it be based on? Because this is such a seminal work. So it's a real pleasure for me to be able to share my love of this book with you today. I've considered over the years writing a book called Everything I Ever Needed to Know I Learned in the Odyssey. I don't know how well that would resonate with audiences, but I have learned a lot from it. And for what it's worth, my middle name, O, as in Michael Overhola, is Odysseus. So I feel an emotional connection to the book as a result of that. I've made an effort today to choose a wide variety of art from many, many different sources and periods rather than just taking images from one publication of the Odyssey, because I want to try to give a sense for all the times and ways this book has been represented and the different forms of art, the different media it's been represented in. And what we're looking at here is a 2nd century AD mosaic from Tunisia depicting one of the iconic episodes from the Odyssey, Odysseus' encounter with the sirens. And we can see they are depicted as bird-legged women over here on the right, and we could see Odysseus tied to the mast of his ship. And I will not be enigmatic indefinitely. I will explain to you what the significance of this scene is as we move ahead. And finally, before we jump into the body of the presentation, the title of our presentation today, Sailing the Wine Dark Sea, comes from one of the lines that Homer uses, a recurring line throughout the book, and he refers to Odysseus and the other Achaeans, the other Greeks who went to Troy and then came back from it as sailing the wine dark sea. So it was sort of a poetic trope of the era. So the Odyssey takes its name from the hero Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, which is an island off of the western coast of Greece, probably somewhere around Corfu, between Corfu and mainland Greece. And he is the primary subject of the story, which focuses on his journey home from the Trojan War. And this was the 10-year war. The Trojan War was the 10-year war fought between the Greeks and the city of Troy. The word Odyssey has, in fact, come in our language to refer to any epic voyage, securing for its namesake the everlasting fame that the heroes of antiquity craved. This is what the heroes of this era, the Bronze Age, were deathly afraid of, that they would die and their children would remember them and their grandchildren might kind of remember them, and mostly people didn't live long enough to have great-grandchildren. So by the time their grandchildren died, they would simply be forgotten. And obviously, if 3,000 years later, your name is the name of one of the greatest works of Western literature, you haven't been forgotten. So Odysseus would presumably be very pleased with that. The Odyssey is generally believed to have been authored in the 8th century BC in Ionia, a coastal area inhabited by Greeks in what is now modern Turkey, and to have been written by a blind bard named Homer. And we can see him depicted here, being guided across Mount Ida by a goat herd in this 1874 painting by artist William Adolphe Bouguereau. And there's a debate that some of you may remember from when you were in school. Was the Odyssey really written by Homer? And it's just the same as that old Shakespearean debate. Did Shakespeare really write Shakespeare's plays? Well, the proper response is, of course, it was either written by Homer or someone who we know as Homer. So it's irrelevant after a point. So we could see here Asia Minor, Ionia and Asia Minor, which is the coast of Turkey today, over here on the right, to give a sense for where this was written. And that was part of the Greek world. The Greek world really stretched from Asia Minor in the east, Black Sea to some extent, all the way to the Western Mediterranean, and Marseille was founded by the Greeks. The Odyssey is the second oldest existing work of Western literature and is more or less a sequel to the Iliad, the other epic poem attributed to Homer, which, as we noted, is an account of the Trojan War and the oldest surviving work of Western literature. If there was anything older, we don't know about it. Many scholars believe the original poem was composed as part of an oral tradition and that it was more likely intended to be heard than read. So me narrating it to you today is in the spirit of it. The Odyssey was nonetheless ultimately written out in what is known as Homeric Greek, a poetic language that is a literary amalgam of several ancient Greek dialects. All ancient and nearly all modern editions and translations of the Odyssey are divided into 24 books and consist of 12,110 lines of what is known as dactylic hexameter, the predominant style for classical Greek and Latin epic poetry. So that's the most I'll say about that. As part of our crash course on the Odyssey today, we're not going to be looking at ancient Greek poetic structure. Knowing that it had one is all we need for our purposes today. If the events of the Odyssey have a historical basis, then based on archaeological evidence and things like astronomical clues that appear in the book, they probably begin around 1188 BC and conclude in about 1178 BC with Odysseus' return to Ithaca. And then, of course, the Iliad would have taken place in the 10 years before that, so probably started about 1198 BC. And what we're looking at here are two Greek manuscripts. The one on the left is the opening lines of the Odyssey, but it is, well, fairly modern compared to the Odyssey. It was written probably in the 6th century AD in Greece. And then on the right, we're looking at that's about the 15th century, rather. So that's Renaissance era manuscript of the Odyssey. And on the right, we're looking at a 6th century AD Greek language manuscript of the Iliad. And we can see the battle taking place in the illustration there. So as a work of literature, the Odyssey is notable in a number of ways, which include the sophisticated structure of its nonlinear plot, and the influence on events by the actions, not just of heroes, which is really typical of a lot of work that would follow, but also of characters like women and slaves. So there are a lot of characters who influence things in the Odyssey, and they don't have that level of influence in a lot of works that follow. So it's actually a very progressive work in a lot of ways. The Odyssey opens in the middle of the overall story, with prior events described through flashbacks or storytelling. So when I set the scene for where it begins, you're not going to know how our character ended up where we began, and that will be revealed throughout the book. And this is a device that was adopted by later authors of literary epics, such as Virgil for the Aeneid, and it's familiar to all of us today, especially through films and television programs. How many television programs or movies do you watch that have flashback scenes that reveal things about the character, reveal things about the character's past, fill things in about the storyline? And this was a literary device that was introduced in this oldest work of Western literature, second oldest work of Western literature. So I think that's kind of fascinating that a lot of these things that are so familiar to us today are not modern phenomena. They're things that were really experimented with almost 3,000 years ago. I almost never use this many words on a slide, but these are key words. I don't like having bullet points, but these are important to the theme of the book. Several key themes that would have resonated with audiences of the Odyssey appear throughout the book. These include homecoming, which emphasizes the bad ends suffered by many of the heroes of the Trojan War, either before they could make it home or after they did. So Odysseus' struggle to come home is juxtaposed against the bad things that happened to a lot of them, or the good things that happened to some of them. Wandering, with an emphasis on the obstacles to Odysseus' returning home, and that is, of course, the theme of the Odyssey. It took him 10 years to get home to make a journey that should have probably taken about a month. Guest friendship, which provides examples of how hosts should and should not act, and that carries throughout the book, and we'll see some good examples of that. Testing, notably by Odysseus of the loyalty of others and by others of the identity of Odysseus. So when Odysseus meets people, he'll chat them up and try to get a sense for whether they're loyal to him or his memory or his family. When people meet him, they're trying to figure out who he is. And then finally, omens, which appear to various characters in forms that include birds, dreams, and astronomical phenomena. So these are important themes that come up again and again, and you'll recognize some of them when we do our overview of the book. And we're looking at a couple of iconic scenes from the Odyssey that we will touch on as we move ahead. Here, he's sitting on the shore of the island of the nymph Calypso, staring sadly out to sea and trying to figure out how he can escape from her island that he was trapped on for several years. And on the right, we can see him being harassed by the sea god Poseidon as he clings to his little homemade raft. So, the Odyssey begins 10 years after the end of the decade-long Trojan War. And Odysseus has still not returned home to his kingdom and is presumed to have died. Odysseus' son Telemachus is about 20 years old and is sharing his absent father's house on the island of Ithaca with his mother Penelope and a crowd of more than 100 greedy and unruly men, the suitors, whose aim is to persuade Penelope to marry one of them, all the while reveling in Odysseus' palace and eating up his wealth. So the idea is that if somebody earnestly wants to marry a woman, they should be treated with respect and they should be fed and housed. But these 100 suitors are greedy. They know that they're obviously all not going to marry Penelope. They're not really in earnest. They're just taking advantage of guest friendship to despoil the household of Odysseus. And Penelope and her son, who's just now reaching his majority, have not been able to dislodge them. At a point wherein the vindictive Poseidon is absent from Mount Olympus, the goddess Athena approaches Zeus, king of the gods, and requests that he finally allow Odysseus to return home, a scene that we can see here in an 1810 illustration by artist John Flaxman. So Odysseus right now is trapped on this island. We don't know how we got to the island of Calypso. This is to hook us and keep us asking, if we were listening to this, we might ask the bard, well, how did he end up on the island? Well, you just wait, and we'll tell you. We'll get to that. But Athena doesn't want him trapped on the island anymore, so she goes to Zeus and says, Zeus, Odysseus has been trapped on this island 7 years. You have to free him. Then, disguised as a chieftain from a nearby island, Athena visits Telemachus on Ithaca to urge him to search for news of his father. So this is a classic deus ex machina. The gods are putting into play the action of the story. Telemachus offers Athena hospitality, and they observe the suitors dining rowdily while a bard performs a narrative poem for them. Penelope objects to the bard's theme, the return from Troy, because it reminds her of her missing husband. But Telemachus, who is trying to assert himself as the man of the house, rebuts his objections and tells the bard to keep playing the song. So the next morning, Telemachus calls an assembly of Ithacan citizens to discuss what should be done with the suitors. The suitors are really from the local community. They're the sons of the local people. They don't care if their kids are up there eating for free all the time, so they pretty much blow him off. So he decides to set out, accompanied by Athena, to visit some of his father's old friends from the war and try to piece together what could have happened to his father. So, accompanied by Athena in her guise as the advisor mentor, she's in disguise. She doesn't look like the goddess of Athena. She looks like an older man who is advising Telemachus. Accompanied by her, he departs for the Greek mainland and the house of Nestor, most venerable of the Greek warriors at Troy, now at home in Pylos on the Peloponnesian Peninsula of mainland Greece, to begin investigating the fate of his father. He doesn't learn anything useful from Nestor, but it's a good visit with his father's friend, and we can see him on the left departing from Nestor. All right. From there, Telemachus travels overland to Sparta, also on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, on the southern tip of the Peloponnesian Peninsula, where he finds Menelaus and Helen, who have somewhat reconciled with each other. Helen was abducted by a young Trojan man named Paris. She was taken to Troy, and that's what sparked the Trojan War. So Menelaus raised an army, went to Troy, fought for 10 years, brought her back, and they're still married. So they managed to reconcile that somehow. Helen tells Telemachus that she pities him, as Odysseus was not there for him during his childhood because he went to Troy to fight for her. So she feels some personal remorse. And we can see this scene depicted here on the right. And she also tells something to Telemachus about something his father did, Odysseus did. He stole something called the Palladium, which was a statue that protected the Trojans. So Odysseus was very much a commando. He would sneak behind enemy lines. He would kill enemy warriors in their sleep. He stole this magical statue out of one of their temples, which took down some of their protections. He was one of the Greeks that went in the Trojan horse, hid in the belly of the horse when it went into Troy. So he was very wily. So this is a very important scene because Telemachus is now getting firsthand information about his father and the great things that he did. So he still doesn't know where his father is. He still doesn't know what his father's fate is, but he's starting to get some insights into his father's character and how valued he was to the Greeks. Menelaus also praises Odysseus as an irreproachable comrade and friend, lamenting the fact that they were not only unable to return together from Troy, but that Odysseus has yet to return at all. Both Helen and Menelaus also reveal that they returned to Sparta by way of Egypt, and while on the island of Pharos, encountered the old sea god Proteus, who revealed that Odysseus was a captive of the nymph Calypso. So now the story is starting to unfold, and Telemachus is starting to learn actionable things. And Pharos, by the way, the island of Pharos, that is the site of one of the wonders of the ancient world. That was the site of the lighthouse of Alexandria. The lighthouse of Alexandria was located on the Pharos. So we sailed not too far from that, and I'll be looking at the seven wonders of the ancient world in one of our upcoming talks. The story then briefly shifts to the suitors, who discover that Telemachus is gone, and, angered by this, devise a plan to ambush his ship and kill him as he sails back home. Penelope overhears this plot and worries for her son's safety. So we keep shifting back between venues, which is a very modern device. It's amazing there's been so much bad storytelling over the last 3,000 years when you consider that the groundwork for so much good storytelling was laid with this. All right, the second part of the Odyssey tells the story of Odysseus. After he has spent 7 years in captivity on Ogygia, the island of Calypso, she falls deeply in love with him, even though he has consistently spurned her advances, or perhaps because of this. Odysseus' great-grandfather, however, the messenger god Hermes, who has been sent by Zeus in response to Athena's plea to free Odysseus, persuades Calypso to release the hero. And she allows him to build a raft and provides him with clothing, food, and drink. So we still don't know how he ended up on the island, but now we know that he's escaping from the island and taking with him these provisions he's been provided with by Calypso. And we could see this on the left. We could see Odysseus standing on the shore, lamenting and wanting to go home, and Calypso is there trying to figure out how she can get him to stay, but she can't. When Poseidon learns that Odysseus has escaped, he wrecks the raft. But Odysseus nonetheless manages to make it to the island of the Phaeacians, which are an ancient Greek people. Naked and exhausted, he hides in some vegetation and falls asleep. The next morning, awakened by the laughter of girls, he sees the young Nausicaa, who has gone to the shore with her maids to wash clothes. Odysseus appeals to the young woman for help, and she encourages him to seek the hospitality of her parents, Alcinous and Arete. And this scene, incidentally, speaks to the courage of this young woman, because he comes clambering out from behind a rock, covering his private areas with a piece of seaweed or something. So he's completely naked. He's this sort of salt-covered, shaggy man covering himself with seaweed, and he approaches her, and the maids run off in terror. She doesn't. She wants to see who this person is in their land, and she then says, well, you should go see my parents, Alcinous and Arete, the king and queen. Nausicaa's parents welcome Odysseus and do not press him for his name. So this is seen as a sign of courtesy on their part. He doesn't offer his name, they don't ask for it. He remains their guest for several days, takes part in a pentathlon, and hears a singer perform 2 narrative poems. And who came to our sports presentation yesterday? A couple of people. We talked a little bit then about how warriors in this era, nobles in this era, didn't have to do manual labor, but they did have to constantly be prepared for war. And part of being prepared for war was athletics. So the fact that he does well in this athletic competition speaks to his background as a warrior and possibly a noble. So things are being revealed to his hosts in the course of this. So he hears a singer perform 2 narrative poems. The first is an otherwise obscure incident of the Trojan War, the quarrel of Odysseus and Achilles. Imagine going to someone's house and they don't know who you really are, and then somebody starts telling a story about you. It's kind of neat. So there's some cool devices there. And the second is the amusing tale of a love affair between 2 Olympian gods, Ares and Aphrodite, who also are characters in the Iliad. Odysseus eventually asks the singer to return to the Trojan War theme and tell of the Trojan horse, a stratagem in which the cunning Odysseus had played a leading role. Unable to hide his emotion as he hears this episode described, Odysseus at last reveals his identity and begins to tell the story of his return from Troy. So now we start to learn how he ended up on that island. And we could see this scene depicted here on the right, with Odysseus weeping as he hears the story of his great triumph in Troy. That's an 1815 painting by a Venetian artist named Francesco Hayez. So, after leaving Troy, after the 10-year war there, Odysseus and his fleet of 12 ships launched an unsuccessful raid against the Cacones on their island of Ismaros, and upon leaving it, were driven off course by storms. I mentioned the other day in one of our talks, in this era, the Bronze Age, everybody was either defending themselves from pirates or off being a pirate. Everybody was a pirate. And coming back from the Trojan War, they wanted a little extra loot, so they just attacked a city that they happened to be passing so they could fill up the holds of their ship with loot. But it was ill-fated, it didn't go well, and they were driven off and then got caught in a storm. Odysseus and his men thereafter arrived in the land of the lethargic lotus eaters, who gave the Ithacans fruit that would have caused them to forget their desire to return home had the hero not dragged them back to their ships by force. Their next stop was an island occupied by the one-eyed giants known as the Cyclops, where they became trapped in the cave of the Cyclops Polyphemus, which we're seeing here, escaping by blinding him with a wooden stake and hanging onto the underbellies of his giant sheep when he sent them out to pasture. During their escape, however, Odysseus foolishly told Polyphemus his identity, which the giant passed on to his father, Poseidon, revealing that Odysseus had blinded him. So this is hubris. And Odysseus Odysseus does a lot of half-assed stuff. He does a lot of things that sort of invite the problems he ends up having. So, maybe it's best that everything I needed to know I didn't learn in the Odyssey because he does things like that. He could have just gotten away, but instead he says, well, it was Odysseus who blinded you. And then, of course, Polyphemus reports to his father. And this is an early 17th century Flemish painting that depicts sort of the scene with Polyphemus. So after they leave Troy, we're going through these episodes, these most famous episodes of the Odyssey. The Lotus Eaters, Polyphemus, and then the visit to Aeolus. After their escape from the island of the Cyclopes, there were many of them living on the island, Odysseus and his men stayed with Aeolus, a king endowed with power over the winds. And he was a deity. He gave Odysseus a leather bag containing all the winds, except the west wind, a gift that should have ensured a safe return home. Just as Ithaca came into sight, however, the greedy Ithacans naively opened the bag while Odysseus slept, thinking it contained gold. And all of the winds flew out, creating a storm that drove the ships back the way they had come. After unsuccessfully pleading with Aeolus to help them again, so they went back to the island of Aeolus and said, well, give us another bag full of winds. And he wasn't having any of it. So after he rejects them, the Ithacans re-embarked and encountered the cannibalistic giant Laestrygonians. All of Odysseus' ships, his own, entered the harbor of the Laestrygonians' island and were quickly destroyed with boulders thrown by the monsters. And a lot of these themes, the theme of the Lotus Eaters, the theme of the Cyclops, the theme of the cannibals, the cannibalistic giants, they're all going to turn up in many, many subsequent story cycles. The Seven Voyages of Sinbad, for example, tap heavily into the Odyssey. If you've read one and then you read the other, you say, wait a second, that's almost exactly the same scene. And of course, the Seven Voyages of Sinbad were written, maybe 1,800 years later. So they are drawing directly on the Odyssey. And we'll be talking about the Seven Voyages of Sinbad maybe tomorrow on an upcoming day. So that is something that you might enjoy as well. Odysseus sailed on in his remaining vessel and visited the witch goddess Circe, who turned half of his men into animals after giving them food. So this is what Circe did. People would land on her island, she would turn them into animals, and then, either eat them or use them for labor. And we could see one of my favorite depictions of this episode here. It's almost whimsical, but it's a 16th century woodcut by a German printer named Johann Zeiner. And this is Odysseus and his men. And you could see all of them have been turned into anthropomorphic animals. And Odysseus there with the Latin Ulysses above him is standing there sizing up Circe and figuring out how he's going to deal with this situation. So Hermes warned Odysseus about Circe and gave him an herb that imbued him with resistance to Circe's magic. It's good to have a great-grandfather who's a powerful god. Odysseus then forced the now powerless witch, because he's immune to her magic, to change his men back to their human forms, after which they remained with her for a year of feasting and drinking. So once again, we see the sort of guest host relationship, I'd say somewhat being abused. But Odysseus was nothing if not a little vindictive, and he figured, well, they turned all my men into animals. We got through this situation. We're going to stay here and just eat and drink for a year. Finally, guided by Circe's instructions, Odysseus and his crew crossed the Mediterranean and reached a harbor at the western edge of the world. Possibly, one theory, around the city of Cadiz, so that they might have gone through the Pillars of Hercules and gone to what is now Cadiz. That might be the area where they entered the underworld. That's one theory. There, Odysseus sacrificed to the dead and entered the underworld. He first encountered the spirit of a crewman who had gotten drunk and fallen from a roof to his death at Circe's home, which had gone unnoticed by the others before the Ithacans departed. So they were in pretty bad shape when they left. This shade, this ghost, implored Odysseus to bury his body when he returned to the island of Circe, which he promised to do. Odysseus then summoned the spirit of the prophet Tiresias for advice on how to appease Poseidon upon his return home. He doesn't want to have an ongoing feud with the god of the sea. Odysseus next met with the spirit of his own mother, who had died of grief during his long absence. From her, he got his first news of his own household and the threat to it from the greedy suitors. And this scene, I think, is in part intended by the bard, by Homer, to tell us that this isn't just some sort of an out-of-body experience or a delusion that Odysseus has. He doesn't dream that he goes to the underworld and meet people who he knows are dead. He goes to the underworld and he meets people who he didn't know had died, and he gets current information from them. So the dead could know things on earth up until the point they died. So before his mother died, the suitors had moved into the house, and he learns this from her. So this is part of the author saying, this is a real thing, this is really happening, because he's getting information that he could not have gotten just through a delusion or a dream. Finally, Odysseus met the shades of a number of famous men and women, including those of Agamemnon and Achilles. Returning to Circe's island, so his old buddies from the war, and he finds out what happened to them. Returning to Circe's island, Odysseus and his men received advice from her about the remaining stages of their journey. So we've got a couple more iconic scenes here, and some that tie in with our itinerary, which I will reveal to you. After departing Circe's island for the final time, Odysseus and his crew sailed past the land of the Sirens, beautiful women whose singing induced mariners to steer toward the rocks and founder on them. Acting upon information provided by Circe, however, all of the Ithacans plugged their ears with beeswax, except for Odysseus, who ordered his men to tie him to the mast of their ship as he wanted to hear the song. So Odysseus is the original person who just wants to experience everything, regardless of the possible detriment as a result of doing so. Odysseus and his men, and we can see the scene here, the sirens trying to tempt the Greek sailors, actually a very melodramatic depiction of this, and Odysseus going mad. He's tied to the mast, but he's yelling to his men, untie me, let me go with the sirens, but they have their ears plugged, so they can't do that. So he wanted to sort of experience that and see what it would be like, but not end up dying. Odysseus and his men then encountered the six-headed monster Scylla, and the whirlpool Charybdis, we can see a depiction of that on the right, losing a half dozen men to the former monster and narrowly avoiding destruction by the latter. And this episode is believed to have taken place in the Straits of Messina. There are a lot of clues in the book, the Straits of Messina, which we sailed through the day after we left Rome. There are clues in the Odyssey that suggest that the Straits of Messina are where Scylla and Charybdis were located. And then another story, Jason and the Argonauts, which took place in the generation before the Odyssey. Jason and the Argonauts sail through the Straits of Messina and encounter Scylla and Charybdis. So they are a recurring trope, a recurring pair of monsters that are associated with that geographical area. So, we know from the Odyssey that the Greeks next landed on the island of Trinacria. Trinacria, you probably didn't learn this when we were in Sicily because it is a little obscure, but Trinacria is actually one of the names for Sicily. So we know flat out that they were on Sicily because the book says they went to Sicily, they went to Trinacria. Zeus caused a storm that prevented them from leaving, and while Odysseus was off praying that they should be able to, his men ignored the warnings of Tiresias and Circe and killed some of the sacred cattle of the sun god Helios. So one of the things that Circe told them, one of the things that Tiresias in the underworld told them, don't molest the cows of the sun god Helios. So naturally, Any guys who are going to open a bag full of wind because they think it's full of gold and get blown off course are going to go kill one of some of the cattle of the sun god Helios. So they did that, and we could see that depicted here in a mid-16th century painting by Italian artist Pellegrino Tibaldi depicting the theft of Helios's cattle by Odysseus's foolish men. Helios insisted that Zeus punish the men for this sacrilege, and the king of the gods responded by sundering the Greeks' ship with a thunderbolt, causing all but Odysseus to be drowned. And who here's been to Rhodes? Few people. Even those of you who haven't been to Rhodes will recall probably that one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world was there. It was the Colossus of Rhodes, which was this immense statue that was said to stand astride the entrance to the harbor of Rhodes. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and that depicted Helios. That depicted the sun god Helios. So it's the same Helios on Rhodes, who was the patron of Rhodes, who we're seeing here with his cattle on Trinacria, Sicily. Washed ashore on the island of Ogygia, Odysseus was compelled to remain there with the sea nymph Calypso. So he went through all of this stuff. And remember, these are all stories within stories. He's telling this to Alcinous and Arete on the island of the Phaeacians. He's recounting this to them. So finally, we know what led Odysseus to land on the island of Calypso. We've been brought now up into real time. Odysseus was compelled to remain there with Calypso, bored, homesick, and trapped for 7 years until she was ordered by Zeus via Hermes to release the hero. From there, of course, he ultimately made his way to the land of the Phaeacians and recounted his tale to them. So we've now been brought up into real time in the context of the story. Having listened with rapt attention to his story, and keep in mind, one of the reasons there was guest friendship, one of the reasons, there are many reasons why there was guest friendship, why hosts were good to people who came to their doors, and why the gods smiled on that. But there was a practical reason, and that was to get news, and that was to get stories, and that was to get entertainment. And once you've heard all the stories somebody has to tell, you'll do anything to hear a new and interesting story. So Odysseus was being a good guest by telling interesting and fascinating tales to his hosts. So he was a good guest, and they appreciated him. So having listened with rapt attention to his story, the Phaeacians agreed to help Odysseus get home and delivered him at night to a hidden harbor on Ithaca. And we can see his departure depicted here in this 1646 painting by French artist Claude Lorraine. And it's a medieval depiction, so probably the Isle of the Phaeacians was not quite as well developed, didn't have quite this much infrastructure. But this is what we get with period artistic depictions. They are using the imagery that the artist is familiar with. He hasn't got a repository. He can't get online and look up what some of these things would have looked like. So he imagines that the harbor of the Phaeacians would look like the harbor that he can look out and see himself. Odysseus, thereafter, now on Ithaca, finds his way to the hut of one of his own servants, the swineherd Eumaeus, and Athena disguises him, Odysseus, as a wandering beggar so that he can assess how things stand in his household. So Odysseus is now back on Ithaca for the first time after 10 years, and he's trying to get the lay of the land, figure out who he can trust, who he can't trust, what's going on. Meanwhile, Telemachus sails home from Sparta, evading the ambush set by the suitors. He disembarks off on the coast of Ithaca and goes to Eumaeus' hut, where he meets Odysseus, who reveals himself as the younger man's father. So Eumaeus is a trusted servant, and he's described as a swineherd, but he's a really sturdy warrior. This was not an age of over-specialization. So this was a guy who was a swineherd, but he was also a stalwart servant and a tough warrior who takes part in the last battle of the story, which we're about to look at. So Odysseus reveals himself to Telemachus, and great father-son project they bond over resolving to slay the suitors. So this is the first thing. Son, I'm your father. Father, I'm so overwhelmed that you're here. Let's kill the suitors. So this is the first thing they decide to do. They're both of a like mind on this. Telemachus goes home first, and then, because they're trying to be very canny now, they don't want to be revealed, because there's 100 suitors, and they could very easily get killed at this point. Telemachus goes home first, and then accompanied by Eumaeus, Odysseus returns to his house, still pretending to be a beggar. There, in one of the most moving episodes in the story, in any story, his dog, who has clung to life, waiting for the return of his master, recognizes him and then dies. So his dog is the only one that recognizes him in the guise of a beggar, and his dog recognizes him, and then because his master's home, he dies. Odysseus is then ridiculed by the suitors in his own home. He meets his wife, Penelope, and tests her intentions by saying he once met her husband in Crete, and closely questioned, he adds that he had recently learned more of Odysseus' wanderings. Odysseus' identity, however, is discovered by the housekeeper Eurycleia when she recognizes an old scar as she is washing his feet as a courtesy to the guest, and Odysseus swears her to secrecy. So that is an episode that took place when Odysseus was young. He was out hunting a boar. The boar ambushed him and ran up behind him and gored the back of his leg with its tusk. So he had this scar on the back of his leg that only someone who knew him very well throughout his life would recognize. But Eurycleia, his old housekeeper, recognizes it. The next day, at Athena's prompting, Penelope maneuvers the suitors into competing for her hand in an archery competition using Odysseus' bow, declaring that the man who can string and shoot through a dozen axe heads would win. So I think we're talking about the sockets of the axe heads. The axes would have been lined up, so the sockets were all in a line with each other. So somebody would have to be a really good archer to line up the shot to make it through the first socket and fire truly and flatly enough that the arrow would go through all of the sockets of the axes. Odysseus also takes part in the competition, and he alone is able to string the bow and shoot it. He then throws off his rags and kills the lead suitor with his next arrow. So this is an amazingly dramatic scene. All these guys are taking part in this competition. They're eating, they're drinking. They're making fun of this beggar. Somebody slaps him. Somebody slaps Odysseus. So people are laughing and carousing and having fun. And then the beggar strings the bow, fires an arrow through the axe heads, draws another arrow, turns, and cuts down the first of the suitors. So suddenly it gets real. And then his allies jump in. Then Odysseus, Telemachus, Eumaeus, and Philaudius, the cowherd, kill the rest of the suitors, first using the rest of the arrows, and then swords and spears once both sides have armed themselves. So part of the preparation for this is that Penelope and her loyal maids went in and they took all of the weapons out of the great hall. And the suitors say, "Why are you taking the weapons out of the hall?" And she says, "Well, you guys drink a lot. I don't want any of you to get hurt." So the groundwork is laid for all this. This is an ambush. They trap these guys in this big hall. They take all of the weapons out. And then these four men proceed to just wade through the hall and massacre all 100 of them. And we could see another 1810 illustration by artist John Flaxman. In this case, it's been modified to be evocative of classical Greek red figure pottery. Once the battle is won, Odysseus and Telemachus proceed to hang 12 of the household maids, whom Eurycleia identifies as being guilty of collaborating with the suitors. As we noted, Odysseus is nothing if not a little vindictive. And then they mutilate and kill a servant who had mocked and abused Odysseus and also brought weapons and armor to the suitors. So everybody reveals themselves in this denouement, in this final scene. Finally, Odysseus reveals himself to Penelope. She's hesitant. Remember, he's been gone 20 years, but recognizes him when he mentions that he made their bed from an olive tree still rooted in the ground. So one of the posts of their bed is actually a living olive tree. Nobody knows this except Odysseus and Penelope. So this is the tell. This is how he reveals himself to her. The next day, Odysseus and Telemachus visit the farm of his father Laertes, who likewise accepts his identity only when Odysseus correctly describes the orchard that the old man had previously given him. And interestingly, Laertes is himself a hero of significance. I mentioned that Jason and the Argonauts, that their story took place in the generation before the Odyssey. Laertes was one of the Argonauts. He's one of the people that sailed to the Colchis and retrieved the golden fleece. And Odysseus' dog who died was in fact named Argos, which is obviously a reference to the name of the ship. So when the father came back after being one of the Argonauts, he named the dog that he gave his son Argos after the ship that he had sailed on. So Laertes is a hero of some note. He's old now, but he is a hero. So Odysseus correctly describes the orchard that the old man had previously given him, and that proves to Laertes that he really is his son. The citizens of Ithaca have followed Odysseus, however, planning to avenge the killing of the suitors, their sons and brothers and relatives. Their leader points out that Odysseus has now caused the deaths of 2 generations of the men of Ithaca, his warriors and sailors, not one of whom survived, and the suitors who he's massacred. And 100 people is a lot in the kinds of communities we're talking about. Athena intervenes in a dea ex machina, as it were, and persuades both sides to give up the vendetta. After this, Ithaca is at peace once more, concluding the Odyssey. And I'll just give a final comment on the geography of the Odyssey. Events in the main sequence of the story, with the exception of Odysseus' embedded narrative of his wanderings, take place in the Peloponnese, okay, which we can see Ithaca over there on the right, and that's the Peloponnesian Peninsula that it's next to, in what are now called the Ionian Islands, all right? And then, of course, Troy is located up there by the Hellespont, by the entrance to the Black Sea. There are difficulties in the apparently simple identification of Ithaca, the homeland of Odysseus, which may or may not be the same as the island of the same name that is located in the Ionian Sea off the west coast of mainland Greece. We have an island named Ithaca, but its appearance doesn't match that of the descriptions in the Odyssey. So there might have been another island might have been known as Ithaca, and somehow the name got transferred in the 3 millennia since. The wanderings that Odysseus related to the Phaeacians and their location and the location of their own island of Scheria pose more fundamental problems if real-world geography is to be applied. Scholars, both ancient and modern, are divided as to whether or not any of the places visited by Odysseus after his Maros in what is known as Thrace and before his return to Ithaca have a basis in reality. I think that it's a bit of a foolish argument, though. You'll talk to some scholars who will say, no, it's all fantasy, it's all made up. But we actually have names of real places that he went to in some of them, Trinacria, Sicily being one of them. Over the centuries, however, innumerable researchers have postulated where various locations from the story might have been located and what Odysseus' circuitous 10-year-long route home from Troy might have been. All right. Well, thank you. I hope those of you who enjoyed the Odyssey when you read it in school or read it since had some good memories brought back in our recap of it. I venture to say most people who even read it at one point didn't remember it had the kind of structure that it did. I read it in school, which was, of course, tedious. Everything in school was less fun than it should have been. And then when I reread it as an adult, I got a lot more out of it and really got an appreciation for its structure. I have been warned not to be taking questions and answers because the theater needs to get used for something else. I am, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, trying to get some kind of a space lined up that we can use for, an hour or an hour and a half, sometime during one of the C days, where we can just do a general Q&A tying in with all of the lectures that we've given. So I will keep you posted on that. It'll probably end up in the newsletter or get made in an announcement. Thank you all for coming. I hope to see you around the ship.